I died 3 times before I ever owned a single acre of land. The first time was when my husband's fist shattered more than my jaw. It broke the illusion that love could save me. The second was when his debts took the roof over my head, leaving me with nothing but the clothes stitched with my own trembling hands. The third? That was the day I stood at a crossroads under a merciless sun, 3 dirt roads bleeding into nothing, and realized no one was coming to save me. I was 28 years old and the world had already buried me alive. But here's the thing about women who've been left for dead. We're the most dangerous kind. This is the story of how I clawed my way back from nothing and claimed something no man thought I deserved. If you want to see how far a discarded woman can rise, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. The sun hammered down on the crossroads like the fist of an angry god, turning the hard-packed earth into something that shimmered and wavered in the heat. Alara Boone stood at the junction where 3 roads met, her canvas bag heavy on her shoulder, her boots dusty from miles of walking. Behind her lay the wreckage of everything she'd ever called home. Ahead lay 3 ribbons of dirt stretching toward horizons she couldn't name. She was 28 years old, she owned nothing, and she was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from years of fighting battles you never asked for. The road to the left led east, toward settlements she'd heard whispered about in passing. Mining towns where desperate men outnumbered women 10 to 1, where a woman alone was either a commodity or a target. The middle road curved south, winding toward railroad towns and possibility, but also toward the kind of scrutiny that came with civilization. People asked questions in places like that. They wanted to know where you came from, who you belonged to, why a woman was traveling alone. The third road, the one on the right, vanished into empty country, stretching west into territory that maps barely bothered with. It was the kind of road that made no promises. Alara shifted the weight of her bag and felt the contents settle against her hip. 2 dresses, a packet of needles and thread, her father's old leather tool roll, and a tin cup that had outlasted every home she'd ever known. That was it. 28 years of living, reduced to what she could carry. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the last time she'd made a choice that was truly hers. Not a choice forced by circumstance or survival, but something she'd wanted. The memory wouldn't come. "Doesn't matter which way you go," she muttered to herself, her voice cracked from thirst. "They all lead to the same place. Nowhere." She'd been standing there for maybe 10 minutes, paralyzed by the weight of not knowing, when she heard it, the distant creak and rattle of a wagon. Alara turned, shielding her eyes against the glare. The wagon came from the south road, pulled by 2 horses that moved with the sluggish determination of animals pushed too hard in heat like this. As it drew closer, she could see the driver. A man in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, his hat pulled low. He was alone. The wagon listed badly to one side. Alara's instinct was to step back, to let him pass, to stay invisible the way she'd learned to do. But something made her stay rooted to the spot, watching as the wagon limped closer. When it was maybe 50 yards out, the wheel gave up entirely. The crack of splintering wood split the air like a gunshot. The wagon lurched, the broken wheel collapsing inward, and the whole rig tilted hard. The horses screamed and strained against their harnesses. The driver hauled back on the reins, his voice sharp and steady as he brought them under control. "Easy, easy now!" The wagon shuddered to a halt, listing at an angle that would have been comical if it weren't so precarious. The man sat there for a moment, staring at the ruin of his wheel, then let out a long, slow breath that carried every ounce of frustration a person could feel. Alara knew that feeling. He climbed down carefully, favoring his left leg slightly, and crouched beside the broken wheel. She watched as he pulled off his hat and dragged a hand through dark hair gone damp with sweat. He looked at the wheel the way a man looks at a problem he doesn't have the tools to fix. She should have walked away. It wasn't her problem. She didn't know this man, didn't owe him anything. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to pick a road and keep moving. But Alara had spent the last 3 years doing the smart thing, the safe thing, the quiet thing. And it had cost her everything anyway. She walked toward the wagon. The man looked up sharply as she approached, his hand moving instinctively toward his hip before he caught himself. His eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they swept over her with the quick assessment of someone used to trouble. "Help you with something?" His voice was rougher than she'd expected, but not unkind. "Looks like you're the one who needs help," Alara said, stopping a few feet away. She nodded toward the wheel. "That's not going to fix itself." His jaw tightened slightly. "I'm aware. You got a spare?" "In the back, but I can manage." It wasn't said meanly, just matter of fact. The tone of a man who'd learned not to rely on strangers. Alara understood that too. She set her bag down in the dust. "I'm sure you can, but it'll go faster with two." For a moment, he just looked at her, weighing something she couldn't name. Then he gave a short nod and moved toward the back of the wagon. The spare wheel was buried under canvas and cargo, crates of supplies, tools, what looked like months' worth of provisions. The man moved with practiced efficiency, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight hitch in his step. He was hurting, though he'd cut his own tongue out before admitting it. They worked in silence at first, maneuvering the spare wheel free and rolling it toward the front of the wagon. It was heavier than it looked, iron-rimmed and solid oak, the kind of wheel that could take a beating. The broken one would need to be removed first, which meant jacking up the wagon, a tricky business when the whole thing was already listing like a drunk. Alara knelt in the dust and opened her bag, pulling out her father's tool roll. The leather was cracked and faded, but the tools inside were still good. Wrenches and pry bars and a small hand drill, each one worn smooth from years of use. The man's eyes tracked to the tools, then to her face. Something shifted in his expression. "You know what you're doing with those?" "My father was a wheelwright," Alara said simply. "I grew up in his shop." It was the first time she'd said those words aloud in years, the first time she'd claimed that part of herself. The man crouched beside her, studying the broken wheel. "This hub's cracked clean through. We'll need to stabilize the axle first," Alara finished, "or the whole thing could collapse when we lift it." Their eyes met. For the first time, something like respect flickered across his face. "Gideon Hale," he said, offering his hand. She hesitated only a second before taking it. His grip was firm, calloused, the hand of someone who worked for a living. "Alara Boone." They got to work. It took the better part of an hour. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into something thick and suffocating, but Alara barely noticed. Her hands remembered the rhythm of this work, the careful placement of the jack, the patient loosening of bolts gone stubborn with rust, the precise leverage needed to pry the broken wheel free without damaging the axle. She'd done this 100 times in her father's shop, back when the world had made sense. Gideon worked beside her without complaint, following her lead when she directed him, offering suggestions when he saw a better angle. There was no ego in it, no wounded pride at taking instruction from a woman. He was focused on the problem, nothing more. When they finally rolled the new wheel into place and tightened the last bolt, Alara sat back on her heels and wiped the sweat from her face with the back of her hand. Her arms ached, her dress was filthy, and she felt more alive than she had in months. Gideon tested the wheel, putting his full weight on it, then nodded once. "That'll hold?" He straightened and looked at her properly for the first time, not with suspicion or assessment, but with genuine curiosity. "Where'd you learn to work like that?" "I told you, my father—" "I don't mean where you learned the motions," Gideon interrupted. "I mean where you learned to see a problem and fix it without flinching. That's not something you get from watching." Alara felt something tighten in her chest. It was such a small thing, that acknowledgement, such a simple recognition of competence. But it had been so long since anyone had seen her as anything other than a burden or a convenience. "I used to do it for a living," she said quietly. "Before." "Before what?" The question hung in the hot air between them. Alara could have lied, could have given him some sanitized version of her story that didn't include the bruises or the debt or the night she'd gone to bed hungry because her husband had spent their last dollar on whiskey and cards. But something about this moment, standing in the middle of nowhere with a stranger who'd trusted her enough to let her fix his wagon, made her tired of lying. "Before I married a man who thought his fists could teach me to stay quiet," she said. "Before his debts took everything I'd built. Before I woke up one morning and realized I had a choice. Stay and let that life kill me, or walk away and see if I could find something better." Gideon's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "Did you? Find something better?" Alara looked down at the crossroads. at the 3 roads still stretching away into uncertainty. "I'm working on it." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Gideon walked to the back of the wagon and returned with a canteen. He offered it to her without a word. The water was warm and tasted faintly of metal, but it was the best thing Alara had tasted in days. She drank carefully, rationing it the way someone does when they're used to going without, then handed it back. Gideon took a long drink himself, then capped the canteen and studied her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I run a ranch," he said finally. 3 hours west of here. Place called Iron Ridge." Alara waited. "It's not much," he continued. "Cattle, horses, enough land to make a living if you're willing to break your back for it. I've got hands who work the stock, but the house—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The house needs someone who can bring order to it, someone who knows how to fix things when they break, someone who's not afraid of hard work." Alara's heart began to beat faster. "You offering me a job?" "I'm offering you room and board, fair wages, and a place where nobody's going to ask questions you don't want to answer." Gideon met her eyes steadily. "I saw what you just did. That wasn't luck. That was skill and precision and the kind of grit most people don't have. I need someone like that. It was too easy, too convenient." Men didn't just offer women jobs out of the goodness of their hearts, not in her experience. There was always an angle, always something they wanted that they weren't saying out loud. "Why?" The word came out harsher than she'd intended. "You don't know me. I could be a thief. I could be running from the law." "Could be," Gideon agreed. "But I don't think so." He gestured toward her father's tools still spread out in the dust. "Someone who takes care of tools like that, who fixes a stranger's wagon without being asked, who walks away from a bad situation instead of letting it destroy them, that's not someone I'm worried about." "You're taking a hell of a risk. So are you, if you say yes." He was right about that. Going off into the wilderness with a man she'd known for all of an hour was exactly the kind of decision that got women killed. Every instinct she'd honed over the last few years screamed at her to walk away, to take one of the other roads, to find safety in numbers and civilization. But those instincts had also kept her trapped for 3 years with a man who'd slowly destroyed her. Those instincts had taught her to make herself small, to avoid conflict, to survive by staying invisible. And where had that gotten her? Standing at a crossroads with nothing. Alara looked at Gideon Hale, really looked at him. She saw the calluses on his hands, the way he stood like a man who'd earned every inch of ground he occupied, the directness in his gaze that suggested he didn't waste time on games or manipulation. She saw someone who'd made her an offer based on what she could do, not what she looked like or who she belonged to. It was the first time in her adult life anyone had valued her for her competence. "What are the terms?" she asked. Something that might have been relief crossed Gideon's face. $20 a month plus room and board. You keep the house running, handle the cooking and cleaning, manage supplies. If you've got skills beyond that, fixing things, keeping accounts, whatever you learned before, I'm not going to stop you from using them. $20 a month. It was more than she'd seen in the last 6 months combined. "And when you decide you don't need me anymore," Alara pressed, "or when you decide you want something else?" Gideon's jaw tightened. "I'm not that kind of man. You'll have your own room, your own space. What I'm offering is work, nothing more. If I ever cross that line, you walk away with a month's wages and use of the wagon to get wherever you want to go. No questions asked." Alara wanted to believe him, but she'd believed men before. "How do I know you'll keep your word?" "You don't," Gideon said bluntly. "Same way I don't know you won't rob me blind in the night and disappear. We're both taking a chance here." It was the honesty that decided her. Not promises or assurances or pretty words designed to make her feel safe. Just the plain truth that trust was a risk, and you either took it or you didn't. Alara bent down and began gathering her father's tools, rolling them carefully back into their leather case. When she straightened, she met Gideon's eyes. "I'll give you 3 months," she said. "If it's not working for either of us by then, we part ways. No hard feelings." Gideon extended his hand. 3 months. She shook it and felt the weight of that choice settle over her like a cloak. For better or worse, she'd just tied her fate to a stranger and a ranch she'd never seen, in country she didn't know. But as Gideon helped her up onto the wagon seat and they turned west onto the 3rd road, The one that led to empty country and uncertainty. Alara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The journey to Iron Ridge took 4 hours, not 3. The road deteriorated the farther west they went, turning from packed dirt to rutted track to little more than a suggestion of direction through scrubland and rock. The landscape changed too, growing harsher and more unforgiving with every mile. Flat plains gave way to rolling hills, and the vegetation thinned to stubborn grasses and twisted mesquite that clung to life despite the heat. They didn't talk much. Gideon drove with the focus of a man who knew every rock and washout on this road, and Alara was content to watch the country unfold around her. It was brutally beautiful in its way, vast and open and indifferent to human struggle. The kind of place that would kill you without malice if you weren't careful. The kind of place where maybe you could disappear and start over. When the sun was 3 fingers above the western horizon, Gideon pointed ahead. There. Alara followed his gesture and saw it, a cluster of buildings in the distance, tucked into a valley where a line of cottonwoods suggested water. The main house was 2 stories, built from local stone and weathered timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Behind it stood a barn, a bunkhouse, several smaller outbuildings, and a network of corrals that spoke of serious livestock operation. Iron Ridge. As they drew closer, Alara could see the details Gideon's broad strokes had missed. The house needed paint. The barn's roof was missing shingles. One of the corral fences was propped up with makeshift supports. It wasn't falling apart exactly, but it had the look of a place that was losing ground inch by inch, maintained by someone who had too much to do and not enough time to do it. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house, and Gideon set the brake. Before he could climb down, 3 men emerged from the barn, ranch hands by the look of them. They moved with the loose-limbed ease of men who spent their days in the saddle, but their eyes were sharp as they took in the unexpected passenger. "Boss?" the tallest one said by way of greeting. He was maybe 40, with a face like tanned leather and a gray-shot beard. "Wasn't expecting you back till tomorrow." "Broke a wheel at the crossroads," Gideon said, jumping down. He turned and offered Alara his hand to help her descend. "Would have been stuck there till tomorrow if not for some help." 3 pairs of eyes fixed on Alara as she stepped down from the wagon, and she felt the weight of their scrutiny. Not hostile, exactly, but not welcoming either. More like curiosity mixed with wariness, the way you'd look at something unexpected that might be trouble. "Boys, this is Alara Boone," Gideon said, his voice carrying the kind of easy authority that suggested he didn't explain himself often. "She'll be managing the house. Alara, this is Wyatt," the tall one, "Cass and Miguel." Wyatt touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more automatic than warm. "Ma'am." The other 2 nodded, but didn't speak. Miguel, the youngest, looked like he couldn't have been more than 20, with dark eyes that darted between Alara and Gideon like he was trying to work out a puzzle. "She fixed the wheel?" Wyatt asked, looking at Gideon. "Most of it." Something shifted in Wyatt's expression. Not quite respect, but a recalibration of expectations. "Huh." Gideon gestured toward the house. "Alara, why don't you get settled? I'll bring your bag." She wanted to protest, to carry her own things, but something told her this was a test of some kind. Not for her, but for the men watching. So she nodded and climbed the porch steps, aware of their eyes following her. The front door opened into a parlor that told the story of the house in one glance. Good bones, solid furniture, a stone fireplace that would throw real heat come winter, windows positioned to catch the light. But everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, and the air had the stale quality of a space that nobody lived in, just passed through. Beyond the parlor was a kitchen that made Alara's chest tighten. It was a mess. Dishes were piled in the dry sink, the stove was crusted with spills that had baked on and been ignored, and there were cobwebs in the corners that suggested nobody had touched this room with any kind of intention in months. She heard Gideon's boots on the porch, and then he was beside her, her bag in his hand. He followed her gaze to the kitchen and had the grace to look embarrassed. "I told you it needed work," he said. "You undersold it." A corner of his mouth twitched. "Your room's upstairs. First door on the left. There's a pump out back for water, and the stove works if you get the flue open. I'll have Miguel bring in some firewood." Alara turned to face him. "When was the last time anyone actually lived in this house?" Gideon's expression went carefully neutral. I sleep in the bunkhouse with the hands, have for the last year. It's easier that way. Easier than what? The question hung unspoken between them, but Alara didn't push. She was carrying enough secrets of her own to recognize when someone else was doing the same. Tomorrow I'll show you where everything is, introduce you to the operation properly, Gideon continued. But for tonight, just settle in. Make yourself at home. Make yourself at home. As if home was something you could just decide to feel. Gideon set her bag down at the base of the stairs and headed for the door. He paused on the threshold, his hand on the frame, and looked back at her. I meant what I said about the 3 months, he said quietly. If this isn't what you want, you're free to leave. No judgment. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Alara stood in the dusty parlor of a stranger's house, in the middle of nowhere, with $20 a month and a broken past to her name, and wondered if she'd just made the best decision of her life or the biggest mistake. She picked up her bag and climbed the stairs. The room Gideon had indicated was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the valley. Someone had made an effort here. The bed had fresh linens, there was a pitcher and basin on the dresser, and the floor had been swept recently. Alara set her bag on the bed and walked to the window. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, and she could see the ranch hands moving between the barn and the bunkhouse, settling in for the night. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney. Somewhere, cattle lowed. This could be her life now, if she let it. This harsh, beautiful country. This house that needed someone to care for it. This strange, silent man who'd offered her work based on an hour of watching her fix a wheel. It felt like standing at the crossroads all over again. 3 paths stretching into uncertainty, and no way to know which one would lead to safety. But Alara had already made her choice. She'd chosen the 3rd road, the one that led west into empty country. And now she was here, and there was nothing to do but see where it led. She unpacked her meager belongings, hanging her 2 dresses in the narrow closet, and arranging her father's tools carefully on top of the dresser, where she could see them. Then she went downstairs and got to work. The kitchen was worse up close than it had looked from the doorway, but Alara had dealt with worse. She found the pump out back and hauled bucket after bucket of water, heating it on the stove once she'd gotten the flue open and a fire going. She scrubbed the dishes, scoured the counters, swept the floors. She worked methodically, the way her mother had taught her. Corners first, then move inward. Don't rush. Do it right the first time. By the time full dark fell, the kitchen was clean. Not perfect. There were stains that would need harder work and better supplies, but functional, livable. Alara stood in the middle of the room, her arms aching and her dress soaked with sweat, and felt something settle in her chest. Not satisfaction, exactly, but something close to it. Purpose, maybe. She made herself a simple meal from the provisions in the pantry, beans and cornbread, nothing fancy, and ate it sitting at the kitchen table while the house creaked and settled around her. Then she climbed the stairs to her small room, stripped off her filthy dress, and washed herself with the last of the clean water in the basin. When she finally lay down in the narrow bed, Alara expected to lie awake for hours the way she always did, her mind churning through everything that could go wrong. But the exhaustion of the day pulled her under fast, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept without dreaming. Alara woke to gray dawn light and the sound of voices outside. She dressed quickly and went downstairs, following the smell of coffee to the kitchen. Gideon was there, along with Wyatt, both of them nursing tin cups and looking like they'd been up for hours. "Morning," Gideon said when he saw her. "Coffee's hot." She poured herself a cup and leaned against the counter, letting the bitter warmth work through her system while she studied the 2 men. They had the easy posture of people who'd worked together long enough to read each other's silences. "We rotate the herd today," Gideon said, more to Wyatt than to her. "North pastures graze down. We'll move them west to the creek section." "What about the fence line on the eastern boundary?" Wyatt asked. "Found 3 posts down yesterday." "How bad?" "Cattle haven't pushed through yet, but they will if we don't get on it." Gideon rubbed a hand over his face, and Alara saw the weight he was carrying. Too much land, too few hands, too many things breaking at once. "All right," he said finally. "You and Cass move the herd. I'll take Miguel and shore up the fence." Wyatt nodded and headed out, leaving Alara alone with Gideon. You'll need supplies, Gideon said, turning to her. There's a ledger in the office. That's the room off the parlor, with all the accounts. Whatever you need for the house, you can order it when the supply wagon comes through next week. In the meantime, make do with what's here. Where do the supplies come from? Town called Ridgemont, about 10 miles south. We get a delivery every 2 weeks. You can ride in with me if you want to see it. Get your bearings. Alara nodded slowly. This ledger, can I look at it? Gideon's expression shifted slightly, something guarded moving behind his eyes. Why? Because you said I could use whatever skills I had, Alara said evenly. And one of those skills is keeping books. My father wasn't just a wheelwright. He ran a business. I kept his accounts from the time I was 14. For a moment, she thought he'd refuse, but then he gestured toward the office. Have at it. Just don't move anything without telling me first. The office was small and cramped, with a desk buried under loose papers, a filing cabinet that looked like it hadn't been organized in years, and shelves lined with dusty ledgers. Alara stood in the doorway and felt her fingers itch with the need to bring order to this chaos. She spent the morning sorting through the mess, and what she found made her stomach tighten with something between anger and disbelief. Gideon Hale wasn't just behind on his paperwork. He was being robbed. The invoices from the supply company didn't match the ledger entries, prices inflated by 10, sometimes 15%. Missing receipts for goods that were marked as delivered. Payments recorded for shipments that, according to the dates, couldn't have arrived yet. It was subtle enough that someone who wasn't looking carefully would miss it. But Alara had learned to keep books in an environment where every penny mattered, where her father's business lived or died on the margins. She knew what fraud looked like. By the time Gideon returned at midday, dust-covered and exhausted, Alara had spread 6 months' worth of invoices across the desk in neat rows. "We need to talk," she said. Gideon stopped in the doorway, his eyes moving from her face to the papers, then back again. "What did you find?" "Someone stealing from you." She tapped one of the invoices. "This says you were charged $42 for a shipment of feed in March, but the market rate was $35. And this notation here suggests you only received 3/4 of what you paid for." Gideon's jaw tightened. "You sure?" "I've gone back 6 months. It's not every shipment, which is why you probably haven't noticed. But it's consistent enough that it's not a mistake. Someone at the supply company is padding invoices and shorting deliveries." "Son of a—" Gideon bit off the curse and stepped fully into the room, leaning over the desk to study the papers. "How much?" "At least $300 that I can document. Probably more if I go back further." $300? That was a year and a half of Alara's wages. That was livestock and equipment, and the difference between profit and loss on a ranch this size. Gideon was silent for a long moment, his hands braced on the desk, his head bowed. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and dangerous. "Who?" "I can't tell from this," Alara admitted. "But whoever's doing it, they know you don't check the books carefully. They're counting on you being too busy to notice." They counted right. Gideon straightened, and Alara saw something in his face that made her take a step back. Not anger directed at her, but a cold, controlled fury at being played for a fool. "How do we fix this?" "We. Not you. We." "Document everything," Alara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Build a case you can take to the company owner, and from now on, every shipment that comes in, we check it against the invoice before it gets unloaded. They won't be able to short you if someone's counting." Gideon looked at her for a long moment, and Alara saw something shift in his expression. A recalibration of who she was and what she was capable of. "You've been here less than 24 hours, he said slowly, "and you just saved me more money than most people earn in a year." "I did what you hired me to do. I fixed something that was broken." "I hired you to manage the house." "You also said I could use whatever other skills I had," Alara countered. "Was that a lie?" "No." Gideon's mouth quirked into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was close. "No, it wasn't." He gathered up the invoices, handling them with a care that suggested he was already planning his next move. When he looked at her again, there was something new in his eyes. Not just respect, but something that looked like partnership. "I'm going into Ridgemont tomorrow to have a conversation with Dalton's Supply," he said. You're coming with me. I want them to see who's been keeping my books from now on." Alara felt a flutter of something in her chest. Nervousness, maybe, or anticipation. "You trust me that much already?" "Trust got nothing to do with it," Gideon said bluntly. "You've got a skill I need, and you just proved you're willing to use it for something other than your own benefit. That's worth more than trust." He left her alone in the office, but his words stayed with her the rest of the day, working their way under her skin like splinters. That's worth more than trust. Maybe it was, or maybe it was just a different kind of risk, one where the stakes were measured in ledgers and shipments instead of fists and empty promises. Either way, Alara had just stepped out of the shadows and made herself visible, and there was no going back now. That night, Alara lay in her narrow bed and listened to the sounds of Iron Ridge settling around her, the creak of timber cooling after the day's heat, the distant lowing of cattle, the wind moving through the cottonwoods down by the creek. She thought about the crossroads where Gideon had found her, about the 3 roads stretching into uncertainty. She'd chosen the 3rd road, the one that led west into empty country, not because it promised anything, but because it was the only choice that felt like hers. And now, lying in a stranger's house with $300 worth of theft documented on a desk downstairs and a trip to town planned for tomorrow, Alara realized something. She wasn't at a crossroads anymore. She was on a path. Where it led, she didn't know. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid to find out. Outside, the stars burned cold and bright, in a sky so vast it made her feel small and infinite at the same time. Somewhere out there, the world she'd left behind still existed. The debts and the bruises, and the man who'd taught her that staying quiet was the only way to survive. But here, in this harsh and beautiful country, Alara Boone was learning a different lesson. Sometimes the only way to survive was to refuse to stay quiet. And sometimes the most dangerous thing a woman could do was prove she was worth more than the world said she was. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her, and if she dreamed, she didn't remember it in the morning. The morning after her first full night's sleep in months, Alara woke to the sound of voices outside her window. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness and made her way downstairs, following the smell of coffee and wood smoke to the kitchen. Gideon was there, along with the 3 ranch hands she'd met the day before. They'd clearly been up for hours already, their clothes dusty and their faces weathered by wind and sun. The conversation died when she appeared in the doorway, 4 sets of eyes turning to assess her in the gray morning light. "Coffee's on the stove," Gideon said, breaking the awkward silence. "We've got about 20 minutes before we need to head out. The herd needs moving today." Alara poured herself a cup and leaned against the counter, trying to read the room. Wyatt was watching her with the kind of careful neutrality that suggested he was reserving judgment. Miguel kept his eyes on his boots, clearly uncomfortable with having a woman in what had been an exclusively male space. Cass, a wiry man in his 30s with sharp features and sharper eyes, studied her with undisguised curiosity. "You planning to cook breakfast, or are we heading out on empty stomachs?" Cass asked, and there was just enough edge in his tone to make it clear he was testing her. "I'm planning to let you cook your own breakfast," Alara said evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Since I wasn't hired to be your mother." Wyatt's mouth twitched, almost smile breaking through his weathered face. "Fair enough." "But," Alara continued, "if you want to leave me a list of what supplies you need and when you'll be back, I'll make sure there's a hot meal waiting. That's part of managing the household, which is what I was hired to do." The tension in the room shifted slightly, from outright skepticism to something closer to wait and see. Gideon caught her eye and gave a small nod that might have been approval, or might have been relief that she hadn't backed down. "We'll be back by sundown," he said. "Beans and cornbread would be welcome. There's bacon in the cold cellar if you want to add that. I'll see what I can do." The men filed out, taking their coffee with them, and soon Alara heard the sounds of horses being saddled and last-minute preparations being made. She stood at the kitchen window and watched them ride out as the sun crested the eastern hills, 4 dark figures against a landscape that seemed to stretch forever. Then she was alone with the silence and the work. She started in the kitchen because it was the most urgent need, scrubbing years of accumulated grime from surfaces that had probably been beautiful once. The stove alone took her 2 hours to clean properly, and by the time she was done, her hands were raw and her back was screaming. But the stove gleamed, and when she got a fire going in it, The heat distributed evenly instead of concentrating in hot spots that burned everything on one side and left it raw on the other. Small victories. By mid-morning, she'd moved on to the pantry, taking inventory of what was there and what they'd need. The supplies were disorganized but adequate. Someone had been ordering food, just not managing it well. She found weevils in some of the flour bins and mouse droppings in a corner where the grain sacks were stored. It took another hour to clean it out, throw away what was contaminated, and reorganize what was salvageable. She was on her hands and knees scrubbing the pantry floor when she heard footsteps on the porch. Heavy boots, moving with purpose. She stood quickly, wiping her hands on her apron, and turned to find a stranger standing in the kitchen doorway. He was maybe 60, with a face like carved mahogany and eyes that had seen too much to be easily impressed. He wore a sheriff's star on his vest, and his hand rested casually on the gun at his hip. "Help you?" Alara asked, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden spike of fear in her chest. "That depends," the sheriff said, his voice a slow drawl that could have been friendly or could have been threatening. "I'm looking for Gideon Hale. Heard he brought someone new out to Iron Ridge. He's out with the herd, won't be back till evening." The sheriff's eyes traveled over her, taking in the flour on her dress, the scrub brush in her hand, the kitchen that was clearly in the process of being thoroughly cleaned. "You'd be the new household manager, then." "That's right, Alara Boone." "Sheriff Tom Keller." He didn't offer to shake hands, just kept studying her with that unreadable expression. "You planning to stick around, Mrs. Boone?" The assumption that she was married stung, but Alara didn't correct him. "That's the plan." A lot of folks have had plans regarding Iron Ridge over the years. Not many of them work out. Keller stepped further into the kitchen, his boots leaving dusty prints on the floor she'd just cleaned. "You know anything about the Hales? About what happened here 2 years back?" "I know that Gideon's wife died," Alara said carefully. "And I know that's none of my business unless he chooses to make it so." Keller's eyebrows rose slightly. "Diplomatic answer, but here's the thing, Mrs. Boone. When someone new shows up at a ranch that's been barely holding on, people talk. They wonder where you came from, what you're running from, whether you're here to help or to take advantage of a man in a vulnerable position." Alara felt anger flare hot in her chest. "Is there a question in all that speculation, Sheriff? Or are you just here to make sure I know I'm not welcome?" "I'm here to make sure you understand that people are watching," Keller said bluntly. "Gideon Hale is a good man who's been through hell. If you're here to cause him more trouble, you'd best move on now before you get comfortable. And if I'm here to work and earn my wages honestly, then I reckon we won't have any problems." Keller tipped his hat. "Just wanted to make the situation clear. Welcome to the territory, Mrs. Boone." He left the way he'd come, and Alara stood in her newly cleaned kitchen with her heart pounding and her hands shaking with residual anger. So this was how it was going to be. Constant scrutiny, constant suspicion, every move she made subject to interpretation by people who'd already decided who she was and what she wanted. She dealt with worse. She went back to scrubbing the pantry floor, putting all her frustration into the physical work until her shoulders burned and the floor gleamed. Then she moved on to the parlor, dusting furniture that probably hadn't been touched in months, sweeping cobwebs from corners, opening windows to let fresh air chase out the staleness. The house began to feel different as she worked, not just cleaner, but inhabited, like a place where someone lived instead of a place someone was avoiding. By early afternoon, Alara was exhausted, but she wasn't done. She hauled water from the pump and washed the windows, inside and out, until the light came through them clean and bright. She beat the dust from the rugs on the porch and rehung them. She reorganized the sitting room so that the furniture faced the fireplace and the windows instead of being arranged like no one had thought about it for years. When she finally stopped to eat, a quick meal of bread and cheese standing at the kitchen counter, she realized she'd been working for nearly 8 hours straight. Her entire body ached, but the house around her was starting to look like a home instead of a haunted shell. She spent the rest of the afternoon preparing the meal she'd promised. Beans soaked and then cooked with bacon and onions, cornbread mixed and baked until it was golden and perfect, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. She set the table in the kitchen, 5 places, 1 for each of them, and waited. The sun was touching the western horizon when she heard horses approaching. Alara stood on the porch and watched the 4 riders come in, their silhouettes dark against the dying light. They looked bone-tired, covered in dust and sweat, moving with the careful slowness of men who'd pushed themselves to the limit. Gideon dismounted first, his left leg clearly bothering him more than it had that morning. He saw her on the porch and stopped, his expression unreadable. "Something smells good," he said. "Dinner's ready when you are. There's water for washing by the back door." The hands exchanged glances, and Alara could see them reassessing her. A woman who'd spent the day cleaning and still had energy to cook a full meal was apparently worth at least provisional respect. They washed up and filed into the kitchen, stopping short when they saw what she'd done. The room gleamed in the lamplight, everything in its place. The table set properly with mismatched plates that had been scrubbed clean and arranged with care. "I'll be damned," Wyatt said softly. They ate in near silence, the kind that came from exhaustion and hunger being satisfied simultaneously. Alara watched them from her place at the table, noting who went back for seconds and who ate quickly versus who savored each bite. These were the kind of details that mattered if she was going to keep feeding 4 working men, understanding their appetites and preferences, learning what would sustain them through hard days. When the meal was done and the dishes cleared, the hands retreated to the bunkhouse with their coffee, leaving Alara alone with Gideon in the kitchen. He helped her wash the dishes without being asked, working in companionable silence until everything was clean and put away. "The sheriff came by," Alara said as she dried the last plate. Gideon's hands stilled in the wash water. "What did he want?" "To warn me, I think. To make sure I knew people were watching and that I shouldn't cause you trouble." "Tom Keller's been a friend to this ranch for years," Gideon said slowly. "But he's also protective. After Sarah died, a lot of people tried to take advantage. Creditors showing up demanding payment, land speculators making offers, even a few women from town who thought a grieving widower with property was a good catch." He pulled the plug and let the water drain, his voice tight with old anger. "He's trying to protect me, even if his methods are clumsy." "I'm not here to take advantage," Alara said quietly. "I know that. But it's going to take time for everyone else to see it." Gideon dried his hands and turned to face her. "You did good work today. The house hasn't looked this clean or felt this alive in 2 years. It's what you hired me to do. It's more than that, and we both know it." He gestured at the kitchen, the parlor beyond. "You didn't just clean, you made decisions about how things should be arranged, what needed to be fixed versus what needed to be replaced. You took ownership." Alara felt something warm bloom in her chest at the word. Ownership. Even if it was just ownership of household decisions, it was more autonomy than she'd had in years. "Speaking of which," Gideon continued, "I need to show you something. Come with me." He led her through the house to the small office she'd noticed the day before. The room with the desk buried in papers and the filing cabinet that looked like chaos organized by spite. He lit a lamp and gestured at the mess. "This is where the ranch administration happens. Or should happen. Bills, invoices, correspondence, payroll records, it's all in here somewhere. Sarah used to keep it organized, but after she died..." He trailed off, pain flickering across his face. "I couldn't bring myself to touch her systems, so I just started piling things on top and hoping it would sort itself out." Alara looked at the disaster zone with a mixture of horror and professional interest. "How long has it been like this?" 18 months, give or take. "And how do you know what you owe or what's been paid?" "Mostly I don't. I pay whoever shows up demanding money and hope I'm not paying twice." It was exactly the kind of situation that led to the supply fraud she'd uncovered. Alara felt her fingers itch with the need to bring order to this chaos, to create systems that would prevent Gideon from being taken advantage of. "Can I work in here?" she asked. "When I'm done with the house cleaning?" "That's why I'm showing it to you." Gideon met her eyes. "I know this wasn't part of the original job description, but if you've got the skills to make sense of this mess, I'll pay you extra. Say, $5 a month on top of your regular wages." $5 extra was a significant amount. It was also recognition that what she could do here was worth more than just cooking and cleaning. "I'll do it," Alara said, "but not for extra pay. For the same 20 we agreed on." Gideon frowned. "Why? You could negotiate for more." "Because right now you're vulnerable," Alara said honestly. "You've got holes in your finances big enough to drive a wagon through, and until I close those holes, paying me more just makes the problem worse. Get the ranch stable, then we can talk about adjusting my wages. Something shifted in Gideon's expression. Surprise, maybe, or the kind of respect that came from someone making a choice that helped you instead of themselves. All right, he said. $20 and access to the books. Fair warning, it's going to be worse than it looks. It always is, Alara said, but she was smiling as she said it. The next week fell into a rhythm that was almost comfortable. Alara rose before dawn to make coffee and breakfast for the hands, then spent her mornings on the household work, laundry, cleaning, cooking, mending. The afternoon she devoted to the office, slowly excavating through 18 months of accumulated paperwork. What she found was both better and worse than she'd expected. Better, because Gideon's instincts had been mostly sound. He'd paid most of his actual debts and hadn't overextended himself on credit. Worse, because the disorganization had created opportunities for the kind of fraud she'd already uncovered. And because there were gaps in the records that suggested missing documents or payments that had gone unrecorded. She created a system, folders for different types of documents, a ledger for tracking expenses and income, a separate log for noting discrepancies that needed investigation. It was tedious, painstaking work, but it was also deeply satisfying in the way that bringing order to chaos always was. On the fourth day of her second week at Iron Ridge, she found something that made her stop cold. It was a letter tucked into a stack of old supply invoices dated 8 months earlier. The letterhead read Crow Family Bank, and the contents were polite, professional, and devastating. Dear Mr. Hale, it began, this letter serves as formal notice that your loan of $3,000 secured against the property known as Iron Ridge Ranch will come due in full on the 15th of November of this year. As per the original loan agreement, failure to repay the full amount by this date will result in foreclosure proceedings. Alara read the letter 3 times, her heart sinking further with each pass. The date mentioned, November 15th, was less than 4 months away, and the amount, $3,000, was more money than the ranch probably generated in a year. She found Gideon in the barn that evening, working on a saddle that had seen better days. He looked up when she approached, and whatever he saw in her expression made him set down his tools. You found the loan letter, he said flatly. Why didn't you tell me? Because there's nothing to tell. I borrowed money to expand the herd after the drought. Then Sarah got sick and the medical expenses ate up everything I'd saved. I've been making interest payments, but I can't touch the principal, and now Crow's calling it due. Alara pulled up a hay bale and sat down, her mind already working through the numbers. $3,000 in 4 months. That's impossible, Gideon finished. Unless I sell the ranch itself, which defeats the purpose of taking the loan in the first place. What about the cattle? The herd you've been building? Worth maybe $1,800 if I sold them all, which would leave me with a ranch and no livestock. That's not a solution, that's just trading one kind of ruin for another. Alara was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she asked, who owns Crow Family Bank? Harrison Crow. His family's been in banking for 3 generations. He's got his fingers in half the businesses in this territory. And he wants Iron Ridge? He's wanted it for years. Sarah and I bought this land cheap because nobody thought it was worth anything. Too remote, too harsh. But we proved them wrong. Built up the water sources, improved the grazing, turned it into something valuable. Now Crow sees what we built and wants it for himself. The pieces were falling into place in Alara's mind like a puzzle she'd seen before. The supply fraud, the fence cutting, the friendly visit from the sheriff. Crow's not just calling in the loan. He's systematically undermining your operation so you'll have no choice but to default. Gideon looked at her sharply. What makes you say that? Because I've seen it before. My father had a competitor who did the same thing, created problems that looked like bad luck while making offers to help, that were really just opportunities to take control. She stood and began pacing, words spilling out as the pattern became clear. The supply company shorting your deliveries and overcharging wasn't random. Someone told them you wouldn't notice because your records were a mess. The fence getting cut wasn't vandalism. It was calculated to cost you money and time you don't have. And the sheriff showing up to warn me was a message that everyone's watching for you to fail. Even if you're right, what can I do about it? Crow has the law on his side. The loan's legitimate. The loan might be legitimate, but the tactics aren't. And if we can prove systematic sabotage, Alara stopped pacing and looked at Gideon. We need to document everything, every discrepancy, every incident, Every time someone takes action that hurts this ranch, build a case that shows a pattern of interference designed to force default. And then what? Take it to court? Crow's lawyers will bury us. Maybe. Or maybe we take it to the Territorial Land Office and the Banking Commission. Make enough noise that Crow has to back down or face scrutiny he doesn't want. Gideon stood and walked to the barn door, staring out at the darkening valley. You're talking about going to war with the most powerful man in this territory, a man who can make our lives very difficult in ways we can't even predict. I'm talking about fighting back instead of just accepting defeat, Alara corrected. You hired me to manage the household, and I did that. You gave me access to the books, and I'm doing that too. But if you want to save this ranch, we need to do more than just survive day to day. We need to go on the offensive. He turned to look at her, and in the fading light, she could see the war playing out behind his eyes. The part of him that wanted to fight, and the part that was exhausted from years of fighting alone. Why do you care so much? He asked quietly. You've been here 2 weeks. This isn't your fight. Alara thought about how to answer that. She could have said it was just a job, just professional pride in doing good work. She could have deflected or made light of it. Instead, she told him the truth. Because for the first time in longer than I can remember, I wake up every morning knowing what I'm supposed to do. Not what someone else tells me to do, not what I have to do to survive, but work that matters and that I'm good at. She met his eyes steadily. You gave me that when you offered me this job. You trusted me with your home and your books and your ranch, even though you had no reason to. The least I can do is help you fight to keep it. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken things. Then Gideon nodded once, decision made. All right, we fight. But we do it smart, and we do it together. No taking risks without talking to me first. Agreed. Partners in this? Partners, Gideon said, and offered his hand. Alara shook it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip, the weight of the commitment they'd just made. They were in this together now, for better or worse, until they either saved Iron Ridge or went down fighting. As they walked back to the house together, the last light fading from the sky, Alara felt something settle in her chest that was stronger than hope and more dangerous than determination. It was purpose, real, solid purpose that went beyond just surviving to the next day. She was done being a victim of circumstance, done letting other people make decisions that shaped her life, done accepting that the world would always take more than it gave. If Harrison Crow wanted Iron Ridge, he was going to have to go through her to get it. And Alara Boone had learned the hard way that the most dangerous opponents were the ones who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. She'd been counted out before. She'd been dismissed and underestimated and written off as broken beyond repair. But she'd survived, and she'd learned, and she was done playing by rules written by people who wanted to keep her powerless. The fight for Iron Ridge was just beginning. And this time, Alara wasn't just fighting to survive. She was fighting to win. The ride to Ridgemont took 2 hours through country that seemed determined to break anything soft or careless. Alara sat beside Gideon on the wagon seat, the documented invoices wrapped in oilcloth and tucked safely in the box at her feet. Neither of them had said much since leaving Iron Ridge at dawn, but the silence between them had shifted from wary to something almost comfortable. The quiet of two people focused on the same problem. The town appeared on the horizon like a promise that might be a lie. False-fronted buildings lined a single main street, their paint peeling under the relentless sun. A church steeple rose at one end, a saloon squatted at the other, and between them clustered the merchants and tradesmen who served the scattered ranches and homesteads of the territory. It was the kind of town that existed because it had to, not because anyone particularly wanted it to. Gideon guided the wagon down the rutted street, and Alara felt eyes tracking their progress. A woman on the boardwalk stopped mid-conversation to stare. Two men outside the general store went quiet as they passed. News traveled fast in small towns, and a strange woman sitting beside Gideon Hale was the kind of news that would be in every kitchen by supper time. "Let them look," Gideon said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "They'll talk no matter what we do." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of a broad building with Dalton's Supply and Feed painted across the facade in letters that had once been gold but now looked more like jaundice. Through the wide front windows, Alara could see shelves packed with everything a ranch might need. Tools and harnesses and seed, lanterns and rope, and mysterious implements she couldn't name. Gideon climbed down and came around to help her descend, his hand steady under her elbow. The simple courtesy felt deliberate, a signal to anyone watching that she wasn't just cargo. "Stay close," he said under his breath, "and let me do the talking at first." The bell above the door jangled as they entered, and the man behind the counter looked up with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was maybe 50, with a soft middle and hands that looked like they hadn't done hard labor in years. His vest was too fine for a supply store, his watch chain too bright. "Gideon," the man said, his voice carrying the false warmth of someone who made his living convincing people to trust him. "Wasn't expecting you till next week's delivery." "I know, Dalton." Gideon's voice was flat, giving nothing away. "We need to talk, privately." Something flickered across Dalton's face. There and gone so fast, Alara almost missed it. Wariness, maybe. Or guilt. Of course. Dalton's eyes slid to Alara, lingering just long enough to make her skin crawl. "And who's this lovely young lady?" "Miss Boone manages my household accounts," Gideon said, the words crisp and businesslike. "She'll be reviewing all future transactions." Dalton's smile tightened fractionally. "I see. Well then, why don't we step into my office?" The office was a cramped space behind the main store, dominated by a scarred desk piled with ledgers and a safe that looked like it could withstand a siege. Dalton gestured them to chairs that were too small and too close together, a tactic Alara recognized. Make people uncomfortable, throw them off balance before negotiations even started. She sat anyway, her back straight, the oilcloth package on her lap. Gideon remained standing, his presence filling the small room like a storm waiting to break. "So," Dalton said, settling into his chair with the satisfied air of a man who thought he controlled the conversation. "What can I do for you?" Gideon looked at Alara and gave a slight nod. She unwrapped the invoices and laid them on the desk in neat rows, each one positioned precisely so Dalton could see the discrepancies she'd marked in careful pencil. When she spoke, her voice was steady and cold. "These represent 6 months of transactions between Iron Ridge and this company. In that time, mister, Hale has been overcharged by approximately $327 and shorted on deliveries by roughly 15% of total goods ordered." The color drained from Dalton's face, then rushed back in an angry flush. "Those are serious accusations, miss." "They're not accusations," Alara said evenly. "They're documented facts. This invoice from March shows a charge of $42 for feed at a rate of $3 per hundredweight. The market rate that month was $260. You charged 20% over market value and delivered only 3/4 of the weight ordered." She pulled another invoice forward, this one from April. "You billed for 6 cases of canned goods. According to the delivery log I found in Mr. Hale's papers, only 4 cases arrived, but you charged for 6. Mistakes happen. Mistakes that consistently favor the seller over the buyer aren't mistakes," Alara interrupted, her voice cutting through his bluster like a knife through paper. "They're theft." Dalton's face went purple. "Now see here, you can't come into my place of business and—" "I can," Gideon said quietly, and something in his tone made Dalton's mouth snap shut. "And she just did. The question now is what we do about it." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Dalton's hands were clenched on the arms of his chair, his breathing rapid and shallow. Alara could see the calculations running behind his eyes, how much he could deny, how much he'd have to admit, what it would cost him if this got out. "This is a misunderstanding," Dalton said finally, his voice strangled. "My bookkeeper must have made errors." "Your bookkeeper is either incompetent or complicit," Alara said. "Either way, it stops now. You're going to credit Mr. Hale's account for the full $327, plus 20% for the inconvenience and lost opportunity cost. And from now on, every delivery will be inspected and counted before it's accepted. If there's a single discrepancy, we take our business elsewhere and file a formal complaint with the Territorial Commerce Board." Dalton's laugh was strangled and bitter. "The Commerce Board? You think they'll care about one rancher's grievances?" "Maybe not," Gideon said, stepping closer to the desk. "But they'll care when I show them 6 months of documented fraud. And when every other rancher in this territory hears that you've been shorting deliveries, you'll lose more than my business." The threat hung in the air between them, sharp and undeniable. Dalton's eyes darted between Gideon and Alara, and she could see the moment he realized he'd lost. "Fine," he said, the word bitter as bile. "I'll credit your account, but I'm telling you, this was my bookkeeper's doing. I had no knowledge." "I don't care whose doing it was," Gideon said flatly. "It's done now. Credit the account, and we'll continue doing business. But Miss Boone will be reviewing every invoice personally from now on. Are we clear?" Dalton nodded stiffly, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled out his own ledger and began making notations. Alara watched him work, memorizing the way his pen moved, the numbers he wrote. She'd check them later against the credit slip he'd provide. Because men like Dalton didn't stop cheating just because they'd been caught. They just got more careful. When it was done and they had the credit slip in hand, Gideon and Alara walked out of the office without another word. The bell above the door jangled again as they stepped into the bright midday sun, and Alara released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You all right?" Gideon asked quietly. "I'm fine." She realized her hands were shaking and curled them into fists. "He's going to find a way to cheat you again, you know. Men like that always do." "Probably," Gideon agreed. "But now he knows we're watching. That'll make it harder." He looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "Where'd you learn to talk to men like that?" "My father dealt with suppliers who thought a wheelwright's daughter didn't understand business," Alara said. "I learned early that the only way to get respect was to know more than they did and show it." Gideon's mouth quirked. "Remind me never to try to cheat you at cards." They'd started back toward the wagon when a voice called out from across the street, bright and feminine and edged with something that made Alara's shoulders tense instinctively. "Gideon Hale! Is that really you?" The woman crossing toward them wore a dress that cost more than Alara had earned in the last year of her marriage. Deep green silk that rustled as she moved, with lace at the collar and cuffs that spoke of money and leisure. Her hair was swept up in an elaborate style that would have taken an hour to arrange, and her smile was the kind that didn't touch her eyes. She was beautiful in the way that magazine illustrations were beautiful, polished and perfect and utterly artificial. Gideon's expression went carefully neutral. "Vivian. It's been ages since you've been to town." Vivian's eyes swept over Alara with the assessing precision of someone cataloging competition and finding it wanting. "And you've brought company." The pause before that last word carried enough condescension to fill a canyon. "This is Alara Boone," Gideon said, his tone clipped. "She manages the household at Iron Ridge. Alara, this is Vivian Crow. Her father owns the bank." Of course he did. Alara forced herself to meet Vivian's gaze steadily, refusing to be the first to look away. "How charming," Vivian said, investing the word with enough false sweetness to rot teeth. "I didn't realize you'd hired help, Gideon, though I suppose a man living alone does need someone to keep things tidy." "Miss Boone does considerably more than keep things tidy," Gideon said, an edge creeping into his voice. "She keeps the books, manages supplies, and just saved me several $100s in fraudulent charges." Vivian's smile never wavered, but something cold moved behind her eyes. "How industrious. I'm sure you're very capable." The word landed like a slap, carrying implications that had nothing to do with competence and everything to do with the kind of work some people assumed women did when they lived on remote ranches with unmarried men. Alara felt heat rising in her chest. Not embarrassment, but anger. She'd dealt with women like Vivian before, women who wielded social status like a weapon and measured worth in terms of bloodlines and bank accounts. "I try to be useful," Alara said, her voice pleasant and empty of the fury burning behind her ribs. "It's amazing how much you can accomplish when you actually work for a living." Vivian's eyes narrowed fractionally. "Indeed. Though I imagine there's quite a difference between managing a household and actually owning one." She turned her attention back to Gideon, dismissing Alara as thoroughly as if she'd ceased to exist. "You should come to dinner sometime, Gideon. Father's been asking after you. He says it's been too long since we've had a proper conversation about the future of Iron Ridge." "I'll keep that in mind," Gideon said, but there was no commitment in his tone. "Do." Vivian reached out and touched his arm, her fingers lingering just long enough to stake a claim. "We've missed you. I've missed you." Then she was gliding away, her silk skirts rustling like dry leaves. and Alara was left standing in the dusty street feeling like she'd just been measured and found worthless. The wagon ride back to Iron Ridge was silent for the first hour. Gideon drove with his jaw tight and his hands gripped around the reins, and Alara stared at the passing landscape without really seeing it. Vivian's words kept circling in her head, each one a small cut that stung more than it should have. You're very capable, just hired help. Managing a household versus owning one. The difference between someone who belonged and someone who was simply being tolerated until they weren't needed anymore. Don't let her get to you, Gideon said finally, breaking the silence. Alara turned to look at him. Why would she get to me? Because Vivian Crow is an expert at making people feel small, Gideon said bluntly. It's her favorite sport. Is she your... Alara hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question. No. The word was flat and final. We had an understanding once, a long time ago. It didn't work out. She seems to think it did. Gideon's laugh was bitter. Vivian thinks whatever serves her purposes at the moment. The truth is, she wanted a rancher who'd be content to run his operation the way her father wanted, who'd expand his holdings through the bank's loans and eventually fold everything into the Crow family empire. When I made it clear that wasn't happening, she moved on to other prospects. But she still comes around. She likes to keep her options open, Gideon said, and she enjoys reminding me what I gave up by refusing to play her game. Alara was quiet for a moment, processing that. Then she said, She thinks I'm sleeping with you. Gideon's hands tightened on the reins, but he didn't look at her. I know. Does it bother you? What people might say? No. He glanced at her then, his gray eyes steady. Does it bother you? Alara thought about that. 3 months ago, it would have terrified her, the idea of being gossiped about, of having her reputation questioned, of being seen as something shameful. But 3 months ago, she'd still been trapped in a life where reputation was the only currency she had. No, she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. Let them talk. I know what I am and what I'm not. Something shifted in Gideon's expression. Approval, maybe, or recognition. Good, because Vivian won't be the last person to make assumptions. Small towns run on gossip and judgment. I've lived in small towns before, Alara said quietly. I know how they work. They rode in silence for a while longer, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the landscape in shades of amber and rust, and Alara found herself thinking about Vivian's words from a different angle. Managing a household versus owning one. It was true, wasn't it? She managed Iron Ridge, but she owned nothing. She had a job and a room and $20 a month, which was more than she'd had a week ago, but still added up to nothing permanent. She was one argument away from being back at that crossroads, one shift in Gideon's mood away from being told her services were no longer needed. The realization settled over her like a weight, pressing down on the small spark of hope she'd been carefully nurturing since arriving at the ranch. What are you thinking? Gideon asked. Alara almost said nothing, the automatic deflection of someone used to keeping her thoughts private. But something about the last few days, the wheel repair, the confrontation with Dalton, the way Gideon had stood beside her while Vivian tried to cut her down, made her want to be honest. I'm thinking that she's right, Alara said slowly. Not about what she implied, but about the core truth. I don't own anything. I'm useful to you now because I can keep books and fix things and save you money. But what happens when that stops being enough? What happens when you don't need me anymore? Gideon was quiet for so long that Alara thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, My wife died 2 years ago. The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water. Alara turned to stare at him, her earlier thoughts scattering. I didn't know you'd been married. Most people don't. We kept to ourselves. Gideon's voice was carefully neutral, but Alara could hear the edges of old pain beneath the words. She was everything Vivian isn't. Practical, strong. She could rope a steer and balance the books and run the ranch as well as any man I knew. He paused, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. She got sick. Something in her lungs. By the time we realized how bad it was, there was nothing to be done. She died in the house, in the room you're sleeping in now, and after that, I couldn't. He trailed off, swallowing hard. I couldn't be in that house anymore. So I moved to the bunkhouse and let everything fall apart because it was easier than remembering. Alara's throat tightened with a sympathy she hadn't expected to feel. I'm sorry. Don't be. I'm telling you this because you need to understand something. Gideon looked at her then, his expression raw and honest in a way she'd never seen from him before. When I hired you, I thought I was just getting someone to clean and cook and keep the place from falling down around my ears. But what you've done in less than a week, uncovering the fraud, standing up to Dalton, refusing to let Vivian make you feel small, that's not just useful. That's what Sarah would have done. He turned back to the road, his jaw working. I don't know what's going to happen next month or next year. I don't know if this arrangement will work out or if you'll decide you want something different. But I can tell you this, as long as you want to stay, you'll have a place at Iron Ridge. Not because I need you, but because you've earned it. The words hung in the air between them, and Alara felt something crack open in her chest, some sealed-off place she'd been protecting since the day she'd walked away from her old life. Thank you, she said quietly, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in years. They didn't speak again until Iron Ridge came into view, the building's dark silhouettes against the dying light. But something had shifted between them. Not romance or even friendship exactly, but a kind of partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. It was more than Alara had dared to hope for when she'd climbed onto this wagon a week ago. And it was enough. For now. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was almost comfortable. Alara woke before dawn and had coffee ready when the hands came in from their early rounds. She cooked meals that were simple but substantial, the kind of food that fueled hard labor without pretension. She kept the house clean and organized, but she also spent hours in the office, going through old ledgers and creating new systems for tracking expenses and income. The hands, Wyatt, Cass, and Miguel, slowly warmed to her presence. It started with small things, Wyatt nodding his thanks when she handed him a cup of coffee instead of just grunting, Cass asking if she needed help hauling water, Miguel shyly complimenting the biscuits she'd made. They didn't talk much, but they watched, and what they saw was a woman who pulled her weight, who didn't complain about the isolation or the heat or the endless work that came with keeping a ranch running. One afternoon, Alara was in the barn examining a broken harness when Wyatt found her. He stood in the doorway for a moment, backlit by the sun, then walked over to where she sat on an overturned crate. That's been busted for a month, he said, gesturing at the harness. Gideon keeps meaning to take it to town for repair. I can fix it, Alara said, already examining the stitching. I just need some wax thread and a leather punch. Wyatt's eyebrows rose. You know how to work leather? My father taught me. He said a wheelwright who couldn't maintain his own harnesses was only half useful. Wyatt studied her for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. Then he said, I was wrong about you. How so? When Gideon brought you in, I figured you were running from something, maybe a bad marriage, maybe the law, didn't much matter. Figured you'd last a week, maybe 2, then decide this life was too hard and disappear in the night. Alara kept her hands busy with the harness, not looking at him. What changed your mind? You didn't run when Vivian Crow tried to put you in your place, Wyatt said bluntly. That takes spine. And you didn't just take Gideon's money and do the bare minimum, you actually give a damn about this place. That's rare. He turned to leave, then paused. We lost the last woman who cared about Iron Ridge 2 years back. It's good to have someone like that around again. Then he was gone, and Alara was left sitting in the dusty barn with a broken harness in her hands, and tears stinging her eyes that she refused to let fall. She belonged here. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure, because belonging meant having something to lose, and Alara had learned the hard way that everything you loved could be taken from you without warning. That night, she stood on the porch of the main house and looked out at the darkening valley. The hands were in this bunkhouse, their laughter and conversation carrying faintly on the evening breeze. Somewhere, cattle moved in the pastures. The wind stirred the cottonwoods down by the creek. This could be her life. This harsh, beautiful country. This work that mattered. These people who were starting to trust her. But Vivian's words still echoed in her mind. A poisonous whisper she couldn't quite silence. You manage the household, but you don't own it. What would it take to truly belong? Not just to be useful or valued, but to have a stake in something that couldn't be taken away on someone else's whim? Alara didn't have an answer, but as she stood there in the gathering dark, she made herself a promise. She would find one. Whatever it took, however long it required, she would find a way to transform this temporary refuge into something permanent. She would claim her place, not by asking permission or waiting for someone to give it to her, but by proving, day after day, choice after choice, that she was strong enough to hold it. Behind her, the house stood silent and waiting. Inside, the office held ledgers full of numbers that told the story of a ranch fighting to survive. Upstairs, her small room contained everything she owned in the world. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And Alara Boone had built herself back from less. The answer to Alara's unspoken question came 3 weeks later, in the form of a conversation she wasn't meant to overhear. She'd been in the barn, high in the loft, organizing the winter hay they'd just brought in, when voices drifted up through the floorboards, Gideon and Wyatt talking in the tack room below. She should have called out, let them know she was there, but something in their tone made her freeze. "You've got to face it eventually," Wyatt was saying, his voice carrying the patient exasperation of someone who'd had this argument before. "The bank's not going to wait forever. I know that." Gideon's voice was tight with frustration. "But Crow's terms are impossible. 20% interest on a loan that size would bleed the ranch dry in 2 years. Then don't take the loan. Sell off the north section. That section has the only reliable water source besides the creek. Without it, we can't expand the herd. And without expanding, we're just treading water until the next drought or hard winter puts us under." Alara's hands stilled on the hay bale she'd been positioning. She knew the ranch's finances better than anyone now except Gideon. She'd spent hours reconstructing years of scattered records, creating order from chaos. Iron Ridge was solvent, but barely. One bad season, one major expense, and everything would collapse. "There's another option," Wyatt said carefully. "Don't. I'm just saying Vivian Crow made it clear she'd convince her father to forgive the existing debt if I married her and let her father absorb Iron Ridge into his holdings," Gideon finished, his voice hard as iron, "which is the same as selling the ranch, just with prettier words. The answer's no. Your pride's going to cost you everything you've built." "It's not pride," Gideon said quietly. "It's knowing that some things aren't worth the price. Sarah and I built this place from nothing. I'm not going to hand it over to someone who sees it as just another asset to be managed." The silence that followed was heavy with things unsaid. Then Wyatt spoke again, his tone gentler. "She would have liked Alara, you know. Sarah, I mean." "I know. The woman's been here a month and she's already turned the place around. House is running smooth, books are clean, even got Miguel eating vegetables without complaining. That's practically a miracle." Despite everything, Alara felt a small smile tug at her mouth. "She's good at what she does," Gideon agreed. "She's more than good. She's the kind of partner a ranch like this needs." Wyatt paused, and Alara could hear the weight of what he was about to say. "You ever think about asking her to stay permanent? Not just as hired help, but as—" "Don't go there, Wyatt." "Why not? You're both alone, you work well together, and anyone with eyes can see you've got respect for each other. That's more than most marriages start with." "Because she's been here 1 month," Gideon said, his voice strained. "Because she came here running from a bad marriage, and the last thing she needs is another man making demands on her life. Because I hired her to do a job, and turning that into something else would be taking advantage of the fact that she's got nowhere else to go." "You really think that little of yourself, or that little of her judgment?" "I think," Gideon said slowly, "that she deserves the chance to choose her own path without feeling like she owes me anything. She's rebuilding her life, Wyatt. I'm not going to be the next man who tries to own her." Alara's throat tightened. She pressed her hand against her mouth, afraid that any sound would give away her presence. "Fair enough," Wyatt said finally. "But you should know that time's running out on the bank situation. Crow's going to call in his markers soon, and when he does, you'll need to have an answer ready." Their footsteps moved away, voices fading, and then Alara was alone in the loft with her racing thoughts, and the dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight from the high window. The bank was going to foreclose. Gideon needed money, or he needed to marry Vivian Crow. And he'd rather lose everything than do either. The knowledge settled over her like a shroud, heavy with implications she was only beginning to understand. Iron Ridge wasn't just her sanctuary, it was barely holding on by its fingernails. And the man who'd offered her a chance when she had nothing was facing a choice between his pride and his survival. She climbed down from the loft carefully, her mind already working through possibilities. Numbers and options and risks played out in her head like chess moves on an invisible board. By the time she reached the bottom of the ladder, she'd made a decision that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She was going to fight for this place. Not because Gideon asked her to, but because it was hers now too. Every clean corner of the kitchen, every balanced ledger, every fence post she'd helped mend. She'd bled into this land through work and sweat and the kind of caring that couldn't be measured in wages, and she'd be damned if she let it be taken without a fight. That evening, after the hands had finished dinner and retreated to the bunkhouse, Alara found Gideon in the office. He was hunched over the desk, staring at a letter with the kind of intensity that suggested he was trying to will it out of existence. "That from the bank?" she asked from the doorway. Gideon's head snapped up, surprise flickering across his face before his expression shuddered. "How did you—" "I was in the barn this afternoon," Alara said quietly. "I heard you and Wyatt talking." For a moment she thought he might be angry, but instead he just let out a long breath and set the letter down. "Then you know the situation." "I know Crow is trying to force your hand." Alara stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "What I don't know is how much time we have before he makes his move." "We?" "Yes, we." She crossed to the desk and picked up the letter, scanning it quickly. It was exactly what she'd expected, a politely worded threat dressed up in banking language. The existing loan was being called due in 90 days unless satisfactory arrangements could be made. "I keep the books for this ranch, which means its financial health is as much my concern as yours." "How much do you owe?" Gideon's jaw tightened. $3,000. The loan was supposed to be for expanding the herd after the drought 2 years ago, but then Sarah got sick and the medical expenses. He trailed off, pain flickering across his face. "I've been making payments, but Crow wants it all at once now. He knows I can't raise that kind of money in 90 days. "Not through normal means," Alara agreed. She set the letter down and met his eyes. "But there might be another way. I'm not marrying Vivian Crow. I'm not suggesting you should." Alara pulled up a chair and sat down, her mind racing through calculations. "The north section you mentioned, the one with the water source, what's it worth?" "Maybe $1,500 if I could find a buyer who didn't know I was desperate. Half that if Crow gets wind I'm selling." "And the rest of the ranch?" Gideon's expression darkened. "Are you suggesting I sell Iron Ridge?" "No," Alara said firmly. "I'm suggesting you split it." She leaned forward, pulling a blank sheet of paper toward her and sketching quickly. "This ranch is currently one legal entity, owned entirely by you. That makes it vulnerable. If you default on the loan, Crow can seize everything. But if you were to reorganize the ranch as a partnership, dividing ownership and liability, the bank's claim would only extend to your portion." Gideon stared at her like she'd started speaking another language. "A partnership? With who?" "With someone who has capital to invest," Alara said carefully. "Someone who could buy into the ranch as an equal partner, providing enough money to pay off Crow while protecting half the assets from seizure." "I don't know anyone with that kind of money who'd be willing to take that risk." "Then find someone who doesn't need to be willing," Alara said. "Find someone who has a vested interest in the ranch's success because their own future depends on it." She watched understanding dawn slowly across his face, followed immediately by resistance. "No," Gideon said flatly. "Absolutely not." "Why not?" "Because you don't have $3,000, Alara. You've been here 1 month. Where would you get that kind of money?" "I didn't say I'd buy in for $3,000. Alara kept her voice steady, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "I said we'd reorganize as a partnership. You need capital, and I need security. What if we approach this differently?" She pulled another sheet of paper forward and began writing numbers. "The ranch's total value, including land, livestock, and equipment, is roughly $12,000 by my calculations. You're carrying $3,000 in debt, which means your actual equity is $9,000. If we reorganized so that you retained 60% ownership and I acquired 40%, my stake would be worth approximately $3,600. Gideon was shaking his head before she finished. "You don't have $3,600 any more than you have $3,000. "No," Alara agreed. But I have skills and I have labor and I have 1 month of documented results that prove I can increase this ranch's profitability. What if instead of a cash investment, I offered a contribution of services over time, say 3 years of work at market rate for a ranch manager, which would be roughly $1,200 annually. That's $3,600 in deferred compensation, paid in advance through equity. She met his eyes steadily. You'd get a working partner who's already proven she can manage the operation. I'd get ownership stake that can't be taken away on a whim, and most importantly, half the ranch's assets would be protected from Crow's claim. We'd still need to raise the $3,000 for the loan, but with a partnership structure, we could approach other lenders who'd see it as a more stable investment. The silence that followed was so complete, Elara could hear her own heartbeat. Gideon stared at the numbers she'd written, his expression unreadable. "You're serious," he said finally. "Completely. You're proposing that we become legal partners, equal owners of Iron Ridge. Not quite equal, you'd retain controlling interest. But yes, essentially that's what I'm proposing." Gideon pushed back from the desk and stood, pacing to the window. He stood there for a long moment, his back to her, tension visible in every line of his body. "Do you understand what you'd be taking on?" he asked quietly. "The debt, the risk, the reality that one bad season could wipe out everything we've built? You'd be gambling your future on a ranch that's barely staying afloat." "I'm gambling it anyway," Elara said. "Right now my future depends entirely on your goodwill and the ranch's solvency. If Iron Ridge fails, I'm back at that crossroads with nothing. At least this way I'd have a say in whether we succeed or fail." Gideon turned to face her, and she saw something raw in his expression. Hope and fear and desperate uncertainty all tangled together. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you tie yourself to this place, to me, when you could take your wages and start fresh somewhere safer?" Elara stood and walked to where he stood by the window. Outside, the last light was fading from the sky, turning the valley into a study in shadows and darkness. But she could still make out the shapes of the buildings, the fence lines, the cottonwoods by the creek. "Because this is the first place I've ever been where I'm valued for what I can do instead of who I belong to," she said quietly. "Because in 1 month here, I've built more than I built in 3 years of marriage. Because when I stand on that porch and look out at this land, I don't see someone else's property. I see home." She turned to look at him, making sure he saw the truth in her eyes. "And because if we're both fighting for the same thing, we've got a better chance of winning than if we're fighting alone." Gideon's throat worked as he swallowed hard. "If we do this, there's no going back. You'd be legally bound to this ranch and to me as a business partner. If things go wrong, they might," Elara interrupted, "but they might not. And I'd rather risk failure while trying to build something that matters than play it safe and end up with nothing anyway." She held out her hand. "What do you say, Gideon Hale? Want a partner?" He looked at her outstretched hand for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it. "We'll need a lawyer to draw up the papers," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And we'll still need to find the money to pay off Crow." "One problem at a time," Elara said, and felt something settle in her chest, something that felt like hope mixed with terror and fierce, burning determination. They were still standing there, hands clasped in the gathering dark, when Miguel's shout rang out from the yard. "Boss, we got trouble!" Gideon dropped Elara's hand and was moving before she could react, his instincts honed by years of crisis management. She followed him out onto the porch, where Miguel stood beside a horse that was blowing hard, its coat dark with sweat. "What happened?" Gideon demanded. "Fence is down on the eastern boundary," Miguel said, his words tumbling over each other in his urgency. "Not just down, cut. Someone took wire cutters to a whole section. Cattle are scattered halfway to the territorial road." Elara felt her stomach drop. The eastern boundary bordered land owned by the Crow family trust. It wasn't a coincidence that the fence had been cut the same day Gideon received the letter from the bank. "How many head are we talking about?" Gideon's voice was ice-cold, dangerous in its control. "Maybe 40, 50. Hard to tell in the dark. But boss, that's not the worst of it." Miguel's eyes flicked to Elara, then back to Gideon. "There's a man down there. Says he's from the county land office, and he's claiming the cattle crossed onto Crow property. Says they're going to impound them until ownership can be verified." "Like hell they are." Gideon was already moving toward the barn. "Saddle 3 horses. Elara, you stay here." "No." The word came out sharper than she'd intended, but Alara didn't take it back. Gideon stopped and turned to look at her, surprise flickering across his face. "This isn't your fight," he said. "Yes, it is." Alara met his eyes steadily. "We just agreed to be partners, remember? That means when someone attacks this ranch, they're attacking me too. I'm coming." For a moment, she thought he'd argue. But then something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or acceptance of what they'd just committed to. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Well enough." "Then let's go." 20 minutes later, Alara was bouncing along on a stocky mare named Sage, trying to remember everything her father had taught her about riding during the rare times they'd had access to horses. It had been years and her muscles were already screaming in protest, but she gritted her teeth and held on. The eastern boundary was a 40-minute ride in full dark, with only the moon to light their way. When they arrived, Alara could see the damage immediately. A section of fence, at least 30 yards long, had been systematically destroyed, the wire cut and posts pulled up. Beyond it, the shadowy forms of cattle milled in confusion, and standing beside a wagon with an official-looking seal on the side was a thin man in a suit that looked absurdly out of place in the wilderness. "Gideon Hale," the man called out as they approached. "I'm Howard Finch, assistant to the county land commissioner. I'm afraid I'm going to need to see your brand registry and proof of ownership for these animals." "Those cattle have Iron Ridge brands," Gideon said, dismounting smoothly. "They're on my land, coming through a fence that was deliberately cut. The only question here is who's going to pay for the damage and the recovery costs." Finch smiled, but there was nothing friendly in it. "Actually, Mr. Hale, these cattle are currently on land owned by the Crow Family Trust. And given the outstanding financial matters between yourself and Mr. Crow, I'm afraid we can't simply take your word regarding ownership." "You're claiming I don't own my own cattle?" "I'm saying that until your debts are settled, any assets of questionable status need to be held in escrow pending resolution." Finch pulled out a document and held it up. "I have authorization from the county to impound any livestock found on Crow property without clear documentation of ownership." Alara saw Gideon's hands curl into fists, saw the rage building behind his carefully controlled expression. And she knew, absolutely knew, that if he let that rage loose right now, Finch would have exactly the excuse he needed to cause real trouble. She slid down from Sage's back, her legs nearly buckling when they hit the ground, and walked forward before she could talk herself out of it. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline singing through her veins. "I'm Alara Boone, operational manager for Iron Ridge Ranch. May I see that authorization?" Finch's eyes narrowed, but he handed over the document. Alara scanned it quickly, her mind cataloging details and irregularities. "This authorization is dated 3 days ago," she said, "but it specifically mentions cattle found on Crow land. These cattle weren't on Crow land 3 days ago. They were behind an intact fence on Iron Ridge property, which means either you have the ability to see the future or someone knew this fence was going to be cut." Finch's smile faltered slightly. "I'm sure I don't know what you're implying." "I'm implying that cutting fence lines is a criminal act, and impounding cattle based on that criminal act makes you an accessory to theft." Alara held up the document. "This paper gives you authority to impound cattle found on Crow land. It doesn't give you authority to impound cattle that were deliberately driven onto Crow land through sabotage." "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Boone," Alara lied smoothly, knowing that the respectability marker might carry weight. "And it's not an accusation, it's an observation. Those fence posts were pulled up with tools, and the wire was cut with professional-grade cutters. This wasn't cattle breaking through. This was deliberate destruction of property." She stepped closer to Finch, lowering her voice to something deadly serious. "Now, you can proceed with this impound, and we can file criminal charges and civil suits for damages that will tie up the county courts for months. Or you can make a note in your report that the cattle have been returned to Iron Ridge property pending investigation of the fence damage, and everyone walks away without lawyers getting involved." Finch looked between her and Gideon, calculation visible in his expression. Finally, he said, "I'll need to consult with Mr. Crow before making any decisions." "You do that," Alara said. "But while you're consulting, we're going to round up our cattle and move them back to our land. If you have a problem with that, you're welcome to file your concerns with the county sheriff, who I'm sure will be very interested to hear about fence cutting on private property." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Finch folded the document and tucked it back into his jacket. "I'll make a note of the disputed circumstances," he said stiffly, "but this matter isn't resolved." "No," Ilara agreed, "it's not. But it's also not going to be resolved tonight by you impounding cattle based on a convenient crime." Finch climbed into his wagon and drove off into the darkness, and only then did Ilara let herself breathe. "Where the hell did that come from?" Gideon asked, something like awe in his voice. "My father dealt with corrupt county officials who tried to condemn his shop to make room for a railroad spur," Ilara said, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "I learned early that bullies with paperwork are still just bullies." Miguel let out a low whistle. "Remind me never to get on your bad side, ma'am." They spent the next 3 hours rounding up scattered cattle in the dark, and by the time they finally drove the last stray back through the damaged fence line, Ilara was so exhausted she could barely stay in the saddle. Her thighs were raw from the unaccustomed riding, her hands were blistered from handling rope, and every muscle in her body was screaming. But when they finally made it back to Iron Ridge and she slid down from Sage's back, Gideon caught her before her legs could give out. "Easy," he said quietly, steadying her. "You did good tonight." "We did good," Ilara corrected, finding her balance. "Partners, remember?" In the pale moonlight she saw him smile. A real smile. Not the careful half-expression he usually wore. "Partners," he agreed, "though I'm starting to think I got the better end of this deal." "Don't count on it," Ilara said, but she was smiling too despite the exhaustion and the pain and the knowledge that they'd just made a powerful enemy in Harrison Crow. They'd also just proven something more important, that together they were stronger than either of them was alone. It was a start. The lawyer's office in Ridgemont was located above the general store, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked ominously under their weight. Ilara followed Gideon up the stairs 3 days after the fence-cutting incident, her newly drafted partnership proposal tucked safely in her bag. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Brennan, who'd moved to the territory from Boston 5 years earlier, listened to their proposal with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was already anticipating problems. "It's unusual," she said when they'd finished explaining, "but not impossible. The main challenge will be convincing a territorial court to recognize a partnership structure that includes a woman as an equal stakeholder." "The law allows for it, doesn't it?" Ilara asked. "The law is ambiguous," Catherine said carefully. "Women can own property in this territory, but partnership agreements are often challenged on the grounds that women lack the legal capacity to enter into complex business arrangements. You'd need to be prepared for Harrison Crow to contest this." "Let him contest it," Gideon said. "Can you draw up the papers or not?" Catherine smiled, and there was something fierce in it. "Oh, I can draw them up, and I can make them tight enough that Crow's lawyers will spend months trying to find a loophole. But it's going to cost you, both in legal fees and in the social consequences of doing something this unconventional." "How much for the fees?" Ilara asked. $200 for the partnership agreement and filing. Another $100 if Crow challenges and we have to defend it in court." Ilara felt her stomach sink. $300 was almost a year's wages for her, and they still needed to find $3,000 to pay off the bank. "We'll find a way to pay you," Gideon said. "How long to draft the papers?" "1 week, if you want them done properly." They shook hands and left, and Ilara was quiet for most of the wagon ride back to Iron Ridge. The numbers kept circling in her head, adding up to an impossible problem. $300 for the lawyer, $3,000 for the bank, plus operating expenses for the ranch. Even if they sold the north section, they'd still be short. "Stop thinking so loud," Gideon said, breaking the silence. "I can hear the calculations from over here." "We don't have enough," Ilara said bluntly. "Even if everything goes perfectly with the partnership, we're still $3,000 in debt with no clear way to raise it." "I know. So what do we do?" Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "We make them an offer they can't refuse." "Who?" "Crow and his daughter." Gideon's jaw tightened. "I let Vivian think she might still have a chance, string them along just long enough to negotiate better terms on the loan. We buy ourselves time to make the ranch profitable enough to pay it off." Ilara's chest tightened with something that might have been jealousy or might have been fear. "You'd court Vivian Crow just to save the ranch?" "Not court," Gideon said. "Just not close the door completely." Let her father think there's still a possibility of the outcome he wants. That's cruel. It's business, Gideon countered. And it's survival. Besides, Vivian's not some innocent girl who'll get her heart broken. She knows exactly what she wants and what she's willing to do to get it. This just levels the playing field. Elara wanted to argue, but she couldn't find solid ground to stand on, because he was right. They needed time, and if Gideon's careful manipulation of the crow's expectations bought them that time, who was she to judge? All right, she said finally, but we do this together. I'm not going to stand aside while you play games with Vivian Crow. Gideon glanced at her, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Jealous? Protective, Elara corrected. Of the partnership we just agreed to. If you're going to risk your neck, I want to know about it. He nodded slowly. Fair enough. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was the silence of two people who'd just acknowledged that they were in this fight together, for better or worse, until they either saved Iron Ridge or lost everything trying. And as the ranch came into view, golden in the afternoon light, Elara felt something settle in her chest that was stronger than hope and more dangerous than determination. It was ownership, not of the land, not yet, not legally, but of the choice to fight for it. She'd spent her whole life letting other people make decisions that shaped her future. First her father, then her husband, then circumstances and survival, and the cold calculus of having no options. But now, for the first time, she was choosing her own path. And if that path led through conflict and risk, and the kind of partnership that most people would say was impossible, then so be it. Elara Boone was done letting the world tell her what she deserved. She was ready to take it. The week that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see if the ground would hold or crumble beneath their feet. Catherine Brennan worked on the partnership papers while Gideon made carefully calculated appearances in Ridgemont, letting himself be seen at the feed store when he knew Vivian would be there, accepting an invitation to dinner at the Crow House with the kind of reluctance that looked like a man reconsidering his options. Elara hated every minute of it. She threw herself into the ranch work with an intensity that bordered on desperation, reorganizing the supply shed, repairing equipment that didn't strictly need repairing, going through the financial records for the third time looking for money that wasn't there. Wyatt watched her with the quiet concern of someone who'd seen grief work itself out through labor before. "You're going to work yourself into the ground," he said one afternoon, finding her in the barn trying to fix a wagon wheel that probably wasn't worth saving. "I'm fine." "You're not." Wyatt crouched beside her, his weathered face thoughtful. "And before you tell me it's none of my business, remember I've been working this ranch since before you were born. I know when someone's running from something." Elara's hand stilled on the wheel. "I'm not running." "No," Wyatt agreed. "You're standing your ground, which is harder, but you're also scared, and that's nothing to be ashamed of." "I'm not scared of Vivian Crow." "I didn't say you were scared of her. I said you were scared." Wyatt settled onto an overturned crate, his knees cracking in protest. "You're scared that after everything you've built here, it's still not going to be enough. That the partnership won't go through, or the bank will foreclose anyway, or Gideon will decide that keeping the ranch means marrying that woman after all." Elara felt something crack in her chest. "Is it that obvious?" Only to someone who's been watching. Wyatt pulled out his tobacco pouch and began rolling a cigarette with practiced efficiency. "You want to know what I think? Do I have a choice?" He smiled at that. "I think you and Gideon are two of the most stubborn people I've ever met, and I think you're both so busy trying to protect each other that you're not seeing what's right in front of you. Which is? That you're already partners in every way that matters. The papers are just making it official." He lit the cigarette and took a long drag. "And I think Harrison Crow knows it, which is why he's pushing so hard right now. He can see he's losing his leverage. He still has the debt, for now, but you're forgetting something important." Wyatt's eyes were sharp despite the casual way he sprawled on the crate. "Crow's a businessman. He wants Iron Ridge because it's valuable, because it gives him control over water rights and access to the northern grazing lands. But what he wants more than the land is to win, to prove he can force Gideon to bend. So what are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you can find a way to make him think he's won something, he might be willing to negotiate real terms instead of impossible ones." Wyatt stood and stretched, joints popping. "And I'm saying that the woman who stood down a county official in the dark and talked him into backing off is more than capable of figuring out how to handle a small-time banker with delusions of empire. He walked out, leaving Alara alone with her thoughts and a broken wheel that suddenly seemed like a metaphor for everything she was trying to fix. That evening, she found Gideon in the office, staring at numbers that wouldn't cooperate no matter how many times he rearranged them. She knocked on the doorframe even though it was open, and he looked up with the kind of exhaustion that went bone deep. "Catherine sent word," he said. "Papers will be ready tomorrow. We can sign them and file by end of week. And then? And then we have 60 days before Crow's loan comes due, assuming he doesn't accelerate it sooner." Gideon rubbed his eyes. "I've been running scenarios all afternoon. Even if we sell off every head of cattle we can spare and I take a personal loan from the territorial bank, we'll still be 1,500 short." Alara pulled up a chair and sat down, her mind already working through possibilities. What if we don't pay him in cash? Gideon looked at her like she'd suggested they pay in moon rocks. "The loan is cash, Alara. That's how debt works." "I know how debt works, but I also know how leverage works." She leaned forward, the idea taking shape even as she spoke. "Crow doesn't just want money. He wants Iron Ridge. He wants the water rights and the northern access. What if instead of paying off the debt, we offer him something else he wants?" "Like what?" "Like a permanent easement across the northern section for cattle drives. Free access to our water sources during drought years. First option to buy if we ever sell." Alara pulled a sheet of paper toward her and started sketching. "Things that have value to him but don't cost us control of the ranch." Gideon was shaking his head before she finished. "He'll never go for it. He wants ownership, not access." "He wants to win," Alara corrected. Wyatt was right about that. And sometimes winning looks like getting something valuable even if it's not exactly what you wanted. If we can package it right, if we can make it look like he got the better end of the deal, he might take it just to prove he can beat you. "You're talking about negotiating with a man who just tried to steal our cattle. I'm talking about giving him a face-saving way out that benefits both sides." Alara met his eyes steadily. "The alternative is we default. He seizes the ranch anyway, and we both end up with nothing. At least this way we control the outcome." Gideon was quiet for a long time, his jaw working as he thought it through. Finally he said, "Even if he agreed to that kind of arrangement, we'd still need to pay down at least half the principal. That's $1,500 we don't have." "What about the north section? You said it was worth $1,500 if you found the right buyer." "I also said we needed it for the water source." "We need the ranch more," Alara said bluntly. "And with the easement agreement, we'd still have access to move cattle through there. We'd lose the exclusive use, but we'd keep the ranch itself." She watched the conflict play across his face, the rancher's instinct to hold every acre warring with the businessman's understanding that sometimes you had to sacrifice to survive. "Sarah and I bought that section the year we got married," he said quietly. "It was the first expansion we made, the first sign that Iron Ridge was going to be something real." Alara reached across the desk and put her hand over his. "Then let's make sure it means something by using it to save everything else you built together." His hand turned under hers, gripping tight. "You're sure about this? About the partnership, the risk, all of it?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The next morning, they rode to Ridgemont together to meet with Catherine Brennan. The partnership papers were exactly as detailed and airtight as promised, 20 pages of legal language that boiled down to a simple truth. Alara Boone and Gideon Hale would be equal partners in Iron Ridge Ranch, sharing both assets and liabilities, with all decisions requiring mutual agreement. Catherine handed Alara a pen first. "Once you sign this, you're legally bound to this ranch and all its debts. If it fails, you fail with it. Are you certain this is what you want?" Alara thought about the crossroads where she'd stood 6 weeks ago, about the 3 roads stretching into uncertainty. She thought about the woman she'd been then, broke, exhausted, with nothing to her name but a broken past and a bag of tools. And she thought about the woman she was now, still broke, still exhausted, but standing on ground she'd chosen and fighting for something that mattered. She signed her name in clear, decisive strokes. Gideon signed below her and Catherine witnessed both signatures before gathering the papers with a satisfied nod. "Congratulations," she said. "You're now the official co-owners of Iron Ridge Ranch. I'll file these with the Territorial Land Office this afternoon. By this time next week, it'll be public record." And Crow? Gideon asked. I took the liberty of drafting an offer along the lines you described, Catherine said, pulling out another document. Cash payment of $1,500 against the principal, plus a comprehensive easement agreement and first option to purchase. I've made the easement terms favorable enough that he'd be foolish to refuse, but structured them so you retain all actual control of the property. She handed the proposal to Alara, who read it carefully. It was masterful, every clause precisely worded to give Crow the appearance of victory while protecting Iron Ridge's core interests. When do we present this? Alara asked. As soon as you have the $1,500 in hand. Crow's not going to negotiate seriously unless he knows you can back up the cash portion. Catherine's expression was sympathetic. Have you found a buyer for the northern section? Not yet, Gideon admitted. I've put out word, but... The door to Catherine's office burst open, and Vivian Crow swept in like a storm in silk and fury. I need to speak with you, Gideon, she said, her voice trembling with barely controlled anger. Alone. Miss Crow, Catherine said coolly, I'm in the middle of a consultation with clients. If you'd like to make an appointment, this can't wait. Vivian's eyes were bright with something that looked like tears or rage or both. My father just received word from the land office that you've filed partnership papers. Is it true? The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush stone. Yes, Gideon said finally. Alara and I are now legal partners in Iron Ridge. Vivian's laugh was bitter and sharp as broken glass. Partners, how democratic of you. Tell me, does your new partner understand what she's signed on for? Does she know that her 40% of a failing ranch is worth exactly nothing? The ranch isn't failing, Alara said quietly, standing up. And my stake is worth exactly what I make it worth through work. Vivian turned on her with the kind of venom that came from genuine hurt mixed with wounded pride. You think you've won something, don't you? You think that piece of paper makes you equal to people who were born to this life, who understand how things really work in this territory? I think it makes me a landowner, Alara said, keeping her voice steady. Which is more than I was yesterday. You're nothing but an opportunist who saw a desperate man and latched on. That's enough, Gideon said, his voice cutting through Vivian's tirade like a blade. Alara earned her stake in this ranch through work and skill and taking risks most people wouldn't dream of. She's worth 10 of the social climbers in this town who measure value by bloodlines instead of character. Vivian's face went white, then red. My father is going to crush you. He's going to foreclose on that loan and take everything, and your precious partnership will be worth less than dust. Maybe, Gideon said, or maybe we'll find a way to pay him and you'll have to find someone else to add to your family's empire. Vivian stared at him for a long moment, and Alara saw the exact second when hurt transformed into pure calculation. There is no buyer for your northern section, Vivian said, her voice suddenly cold and controlled. My father made sure of that. He's quietly purchased every adjacent property over the last 6 months. Any potential buyer knows that land is worthless without access to water, and the only access runs through Crow property. You're trapped, Gideon. The sooner you accept that, the better terms you'll get. She turned and walked out, her silk skirts rustling with finality. Catherine broke the stunned silence first. Well, that's unfortunate. That's illegal, Alara said, her mind racing. If Crow's been deliberately undermining property values to force a sale, that's market manipulation. We can file a complaint with who? Gideon's voice was flat with defeat. The Territorial Commerce Board that meets twice a year in a town 3 days' ride from here? Even if we filed a complaint and it was upheld, which is doubtful given Crow's influence, the process would take months. We don't have months. He was right. Alara sank back into her chair, feeling the weight of impossibility settle over them like a shroud. They'd been so focused on finding a buyer that they hadn't considered someone might be actively preventing sales. There has to be another way, she said, but even she could hear the desperation in her voice. Catherine drummed her fingers on the desk, her sharp mind clearly working through options. What about a territorial grant? The Homestead Act allows for... We're not homesteaders, Gideon interrupted. We're an established ranch. What about mineral rights? Alara asked suddenly. The northern section, has anyone surveyed it for silver or copper? Not that I know of. Why? Because if there's any indication of mineral deposits, you could sell the mining rights separately from the land. Keep the surface rights for the ranch, sell the underground rights for capital. Gideon's eyes sharpened. That's actually not a bad idea. But surveying takes time we don't have, and there's no guarantee we'd find anything. Then we need to buy time. Alara turned to Catherine. What's the minimum payment Crow would legally have to accept to prevent foreclosure? Typically, the bank would be required to accept any good faith payment that demonstrates ability to service the debt. But that's usually at least 25% of the principal, plus accumulated interest. $750 plus interest. Call it $800. Alara's mind was already calculating. Gideon, how much cash do we have available right now? Maybe $300 in the ranch account, another $100 in personal savings. $400. We need $400 more. Alara stood and began pacing, words spilling out as the plan took shape. The cattle we were going to sell to raise the $1,500. We sell them now. Get what we can. That's another $200, maybe $300, depending on market rates. We're still short, but we're closer. And the rest? Catherine asked, clearly intrigued despite herself. Alara stopped pacing and looked at Gideon. How much are my father's tools worth? His eyes widened. Alara, no. How much? She insisted. They're professional quality, well-maintained. A wheelwright or blacksmith would pay good money for a complete set like that. Maybe $100 to the right buyer, Gideon admitted. But those tools are all you have left of your father. They're metal and leather, Alara said, though her throat tightened around the words. What I have left of my father is what he taught me. No one can take that away. She turned to Catherine. If we present Crow with $800 cash and documentation showing we have buyers lined up for the mineral rights survey, could you argue that constitutes good faith effort to service the debt? Catherine's smile was sharp and approving. I could make that argument. Whether Crow's lawyers would accept it is another question, but I could absolutely make it stick long enough to buy you another 60 days. And in 60 days, we'd have time to complete the survey and find actual buyers for mineral rights. Alara looked at Gideon. It's not a perfect plan, but it's a plan. Gideon was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. Then he said, You'd sell your father's tools for a ranch you've owned for less than 10 minutes? I'd sell them for a home I've found after years of searching, Alara corrected, and I'd do it knowing that my father would understand exactly why. She held out her hand. Partners? He took it, gripping tight. Partners. The next 3 days were a blur of desperate activity. Gideon and Wyatt drove a small herd to the Ridgemont livestock auction and came back with $280, less than they'd hoped, but more than they'd feared. Alara wrapped her father's tools carefully and took them to the smithy on the edge of town, where an older craftsman examined each piece with reverent attention before offering her $90 cash. She took the money and walked out without looking back, afraid that if she did, she'd change her mind. Miguel rode to the territorial survey office and came back with the paperwork for requesting a mineral rights assessment, along with the information that the waiting list was 6 months long unless you paid for expedited service, which cost another $100 they didn't have. So we lie, Alara said bluntly when they gathered in the office to take stock. We tell Crow we've got the survey scheduled and buyers lined up. By the time he realizes we don't, we'll have found another way to raise the money. That's fraud, Catherine pointed out, though she didn't sound particularly bothered by it. It's optimism, Alara countered. We're optimistic that we'll have a survey completed, eventually. Wyatt laughed, a rough sound that suggested he was enjoying this more than he probably should. I like her, boss. She's got the kind of flexible ethics that keep ranches alive. In the end, they scraped together $743 in cash. Not quite $800, but close enough that Catherine thought she could argue it into compliance. She drafted a formal offer to Crow that was masterful in its blend of legal precision and creative interpretation, making their meager payment sound like a generous good faith effort backed by imminent mineral rights revenues. They delivered it to the bank on a Thursday afternoon, handing it directly to Harrison Crow in his oak-paneled office with its leather chairs and its view of the main street. Crow read the offer twice, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. This is a joke, he said finally. You're offering me $700 against a $3,000 debt, with promises of future mineral rights that may not even exist. We're offering you $743, Alara corrected calmly, plus documented evidence that we're pursuing legitimate revenue streams that will allow us to service the remaining debt within 90 days, which, as I'm sure your legal counsel can confirm, constitutes good faith effort under territorial banking regulations. Crow's eyes narrowed. You've been doing your homework, Miss Boone. Mrs. Boone, Alara lied again, knowing the title carried weight. And yes, I have. I've also been documenting your attempts to manipulate the market for ranch properties in this region, your strategic acquisition of access routes to landlocked parcels, and your practice of selectively accelerating loans to force distressed sales. The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. Those are very serious accusations, Crow said softly, his voice carrying the kind of threat that rich men made when they knew they had power. They're very serious practices, Alara replied, her voice just as soft and twice as dangerous. And they're documented in 6 months of property records, land surveys, and foreclosure notices that show a very clear pattern. Now, you could refuse our offer and force a foreclosure, and we could file those documents with the Territorial Commerce Board and the Federal Land Office. Or you could accept $700 today, give us 90 days to raise the rest, and everyone walks away with their reputations intact. Crow looked at Gideon. You're going to let your hired help threaten me? She's not my hired help, Gideon said, his voice steady. She's my partner, and she speaks for Iron Ridge as much as I do. Your partner? Crow's laugh was ugly. How progressive. Tell me, Hale, does this partnership include any personal arrangements? Because from where I sit, it looks like you traded one woman for another. And at least Vivian came with money instead of threats. Alara felt Gideon tense beside her, felt the rage building in him like a storm about to break. She put her hand on his arm, a gentle pressure that said, I've got this. Mr. Crow, she said, her voice pleasant as poisoned honey, you can insult me all you like. You can question my character, my motives, and my place in this partnership. But at the end of the day, I'm the one who uncovered the supply fraud that was costing Iron Ridge hundreds of dollars a month. I'm the one who documented your market manipulation. And I'm the one standing in your office right now offering you a way out of a situation that could become very expensive and very public for you. She leaned forward, holding his gaze. So you can accept our offer and give us 90 days, or you can force a fight that you might win, but that will cost you more than $3,000 in legal fees, reputation damage, and regulatory scrutiny. Your choice. The silence stretched so long that Alara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Then Crow picked up the offer and read it a third time, his expression unreadable. 90 days, he said finally. Not a day more. And if you default again, I'm calling in every favor I have to make sure you never operate in this territory again. We won't default, Alara said, though she had no idea how they'd make good on that promise. Crow pulled out his ledger and made a notation, then counted out $743 from their payment and locked it in his safe. He wrote out a receipt with sharp, angry strokes and shoved it across the desk. 90 days, Mrs. Boone. I suggest you spend them wisely. They walked out of the bank into bright afternoon sunlight that felt like stepping into a different world. Alara's hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to keep them steady. Did that really just happen? Gideon asked, his voice stunned. I think so. I'm not entirely sure. Alara sat down on the bench outside the bank, her legs suddenly refusing to hold her weight. We just bought ourselves 3 months. You bought us 3 months, Gideon corrected, sitting beside her. With a combination of careful research, strategic threats, and the most impressive bluff I've ever witnessed. It wasn't a complete bluff. I really did document his market manipulation. And the mineral rights survey? That was optimistic interpretation of our intentions. Alara managed a shaky laugh. We have 90 days to make it true. Gideon was quiet for a moment, watching the Main Street traffic pass by. Then he said, You gave up your father's tools for this, for a ranch that might still fail. I gave up tools for a chance, Alara said. That's all we ever have, chances. And this one's worth taking. She looked at him, this man who'd offered her work when she had nothing, who'd stood beside her when confronting Dalton and Finch and now Crow, who'd made her a partner not because he needed help, but because he'd recognized what she could do and valued it enough to risk everything. I meant what I said in there, she continued. I speak for Iron Ridge now, same as you. That's not just legal language, that's a promise. Whatever happens next, we face it together. Gideon's hand found hers on the bench between them, his calloused palm warm against her skin. Together, he agreed. They sat there for a long time, Two people who'd found each other at crossroads and chosen the hardest path forward, bound together now by partnership papers and shared purpose, and the kind of trust that was built through crisis and survival. When they finally climbed back onto the wagon and headed home to Iron Ridge, Alara felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt since before her father died. The sense that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The 90 days that followed tested everything they'd built. The mineral rights survey finally came through. They'd used the last of their reserve funds to pay for expedited service. And while it didn't show the rich deposits they'd hoped for, there was enough indication of copper ore that two different mining companies expressed interest in purchasing exploration rights. The negotiations were brutal. Alara spent hours in Catherine's office, going back and forth with company lawyers who assumed a woman wouldn't understand mineral rights contracts. She proved them wrong by catching 3 separate clauses that would have given the mining companies rights to surface water, which would have destroyed the ranch's viability. In the end, they sold 5-year exploration rights for $1,200, with options for renewal if commercial deposits were found. It was enough, combined with strategic cattle sales and careful expense management, to pay off Crow with 3 days to spare. Alara hand-delivered the final payment herself, walking into the bank with a leather satchel containing $2,257 in cash and bank drafts. Crow counted every penny twice, his expression sour as he realized he'd lost his chance to acquire Iron Ridge. "This isn't over," he said, as he wrote out the receipt marking the debt paid in full. "Yes, it is," Alara replied calmly. "The debt is satisfied, the partnership is legal, and your window for manipulation is closed. But I appreciate the warning." She walked out with the paid-in-full receipt, and if her hands shook slightly as she climbed back onto the wagon, well, Gideon was kind enough not to mention it. 6 months after Alara first stood at that sun-scorched crossroads with nothing but a worn bag and a broken past, she stood on the porch of the main house at Iron Ridge and watched the sun set over land that was legally hers. The ranch had changed in that time, or maybe she'd just learned to see it differently. The house was clean and organized, running with the kind of smooth efficiency that came from someone who cared about details. The books were balanced and up to date, with systems in place to catch fraud before it cost them money. The cattle were healthy, the equipment was maintained, and the hands worked with the quiet pride of people who knew they were part of something solid. But more than that, the ranch felt like home. Wyatt had been right. She and Gideon were partners in every way that mattered, and the legal papers had just made it official. They made decisions together, argued about strategy and implementation, and built something that was stronger than either of them could have managed alone. The door opened behind her, and Gideon stepped out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one and leaned against the railing beside her, both of them watching the light fade from the sky. "I got a letter today," he said after a moment, "from a rancher 2 valleys over. He heard about our partnership structure and wanted to know if we'd consult with him about reorganizing his operation. His daughter's been running things for years but doesn't have legal standing." Alara smiled into her coffee. "Are we starting a trend?" "Maybe. Would that be so bad?" "No," she said slowly. "I don't think it would." They were quiet for a while, comfortable in the silence. Then Gideon said, "I never thanked you properly for everything you risked to save this place." "You don't need to thank me. I was saving my own future as much as yours." "Maybe, but you could have walked away a dozen times. When Vivian tried to humiliate you, when Crow threatened us, when things looked impossible. You stayed and fought, and that's worth acknowledging." Alara turned to look at him, this man who'd become her partner and her friend, who'd given her the chance to prove she was more than the world said she could be. "You gave me something I didn't know I needed," she said quietly. "Not just work or a place to stay, but the chance to build something that mattered, to use everything my father taught me and everything I learned from surviving and turn it into something real." She gestured at the valley spread out before them, the buildings and fences and land that they'd fought so hard to keep. "I didn't just stay and fight for the ranch, Gideon. I stayed and fought for the woman I became here, the one who stops running and starts claiming." Gideon's eyes were bright in the fading light. "And who is that woman?" Alara thought about the question, about all the versions of herself she'd been, the wheelwright's daughter, the desperate wife, the woman at the crossroads, the hired help, the partner, the owner. Someone who knows that ownership isn't about property or papers, she said finally. It's about waking up every morning and choosing to build instead of survive. It's about standing your ground even when the ground is shaking. It's about finding people worth fighting beside and fighting for them as hard as you fight for yourself. She looked at Gideon, and something passed between them that was deeper than words. Recognition and respect and the bone-deep certainty that they'd found something rare. I own this ranch legally now, she continued, but I've been owning my life since the day I stepped off this porch and told Finch he couldn't take our cattle, since I sold my father's tools to buy us time, since I stood in Crow's office and refused to back down. She turned back to the valley, where the last light was painting everything in shades of copper and gold. That's what I learned here, Gideon. Not how to manage a ranch or balance books or negotiate with banks. I already knew how to do those things. I learned that I'm allowed to want more than survival, that I'm capable of claiming a place in the world and holding it. And what do you want? Gideon asked softly. Now that you know you can claim it? Alara was quiet for a long moment, feeling the weight of that question. Then she said, I want this. The ranch, the work, the partnership. I want to build something that lasts and matters. I want to wake up 40 years from now and look out at this valley and know that I earned every acre of it through skill and sweat and refusing to accept less than I deserved. She glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her mouth. And I want to keep arguing with you about whether we should expand the south pasture or invest in new equipment. Gideon laughed, the sound warm and genuine. We're definitely expanding the south pasture. We're definitely investing in equipment. Well, we'll argue about it over breakfast. Like partners do. They stood there as full dark fell. Two people who'd found each other when they both needed someone to stand with, who'd built something solid out of desperation and determination and the kind of trust that couldn't be bought or borrowed. Above them, the stars came out one by one, filling the sky with cold, bright promises. The wind stirred the cottonwoods down by the creek. Somewhere in the darkness, cattle moved and settled. The house behind them was warm with lamplight. The land around them was theirs, and tomorrow would bring new challenges and new choices. But for now, in this moment, Alara Boone stood on ground that belonged to her, not by marriage or inheritance or luck, but by her own hands and her own will and her own unshakable refusal to stay broken. She'd died 3 times before she ever owned a single acre of land, but she'd been reborn here, in this harsh and beautiful country shaped by work and partnership and the radical act of believing she deserved more than the world wanted to give her. And for the first time since she could remember, she wasn't running from her past or surviving her present or hoping for a different future. She was standing still, on ground that was truly hers, building a life that mattered. That was worth everything she'd given up. That was worth everything she'd fought for. That was enough. The next morning, Alara woke before dawn the way she always did, made coffee the way she'd learned to make it strong enough to fuel ranch work, and walked out onto the porch to watch the sun rise over land she owned. Miguel was already up, working with one of the young horses in the corral. Wyatt was checking fence lines in the east pasture. Cass was in the barn preparing for the day's work. And Gideon was beside her, coffee in hand, planning their day the way partners do. The work ahead would be hard. There would be droughts and debts, conflicts and crises, decisions that felt impossible, and stakes that felt too high. But they'd face it all together, as equals, building something that would outlast both of them. And when Alara looked out at Iron Ridge in the growing light of a new day, she didn't see uncertainty or risk or the temporary refuge of a woman who'd run out of options. She saw home. She saw the future she'd claimed with her own hands. She saw proof that a woman at the edge of nothing could build herself into someone who owned everything that mattered. The story that had started at a crossroads with 3 uncertain paths had led her here, to ground that was solid beneath her feet, to work that gave her purpose, to partnership that gave her strength, to ownership that couldn't be taken away. And if that wasn't worth fighting for, nothing was. Alara Boone had found her place in the world, and she was never letting it go.